Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. These days, most mums with young kids work. For example, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, keeps a track of the rates of employment amongst mums. In 2019, they found that about 60% of mums who have a child aged 0 to 2 years old are working, and about 70% of mums who have a child aged 3 to 5 years old are working. A common concern for mums who are working, or are thinking about returning to work, is whether this will have a negative impact on their child's development. This possibility has been of interest to researchers for many years, with studies investigating the relationship between maternal employment and child development going back to the 1960s. In this research, the approach has been to assess the work history of mums after childbirth and whichever aspect or aspects of child development are of interest. If maternal employment has a detrimental impact on child development, then there'll be an association between level of maternal employment, for example, full-time versus part-time versus not employed, and kids' developmental outcomes. In addition, researchers assess a bunch of other variables which might influence the relationship between maternal employment and child development. These variables include, for example, the family structure, family income, mum's education level, and so on. So before getting onto the research findings, there are two ideas worth expanding upon, which will help make sense of the findings. The first is the idea of interaction or moderation, and these terms can be used interchangeably, and the other concerns how to think about the size of effects. So first of all, interaction or moderation. Simple way to think about this concept is that it's a fancy way of saying it depends. My PhD supervisor always used to tell me that everything in life is an interaction. What he meant by this is that life is complicated, and so whether something is true is probably going to depend upon other stuff. I'll try and illustrate the idea of interaction in the context of maternal employment and child development. So it's possible that if you were to ignore everything else in life, mum going to work could impact on her kid. That is, overall, there's an association between maternal employment and child development. But if you were to pause and think about it, you might go, well, maybe it depends. For example, the impact of mum going to work on her kid's development may depend upon the quality of alternative childcare the kid gets. If the kid gets low quality childcare, then maybe they're worse off. But if they get high quality childcare, then they may not be worse off, or maybe they're even better off. If the quality of alternative childcare matters in this way, then we would say that the association between maternal employment and child development depends upon, that is, interacts with or is moderated by, alternative childcare arrangements. Now, if this doesn't make much sense, don't worry too much. I've only given a tiny amount of space to a topic that usually gets at least a chapter dedicated to it. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is effect sizes, with a focus on correlations. So when talking about the size of an effect, we mean the amount of variation that something, maternal employment, accounts for in something else, child development. A small effect will account for a little bit of variation in something else, whereas a large effect will account for a lot of variation in something else. So now on to correlations. What a correlation tells you is whether variation in one thing, maternal employment, accounts for variation in another thing, child development. So a correlation is an estimate of the size of an effect. Now you can express a correlation as amount of variation accounted for simply by multiplying the correlation by itself and converting the result to a percentage. For example, if you got a correlation of 0.2 between maternal employment and child behavior, then you would say that maternal employment accounts for 4% of the variation in child behavior. And this is what it would look like as a pie chart. Only a little slice of the pie, a small effect. But if you got a correlation of 0.8 between maternal employment and child behavior, then you would say that maternal employment accounts for 64% of the variation in child behavior. A much bigger slice of the pie, a large effect. Now there are agreed upon conventions for labeling something a small, medium or large effect, but as everyone recognizes, these are mostly arbitrary. Now onto the main show. So as mentioned, research investigating the relationship between maternal employment and child development goes back to the 60s. As you can imagine, there are a lot of studies out there. To make the issue more tractable, I'm going to take the following approach. First of all, I'm only going to focus on research that's investigated the impact on child development when mum was employed during the first few years of a kid's life. And second, I'll only focus on two areas of child development: cognitive development and emotional and behavioural problems. Now, lucky for me, Lucas Thompson conducted a meta-analysis of the findings. So I'll provide an overview of this paper and then I'll briefly touch on studies published after this review. So Lucas Thompson looked at about 70 studies, with some focusing only on cognitive development or only on emotional behavioural problems, and others focusing on both. Across these studies, the total number of kids included was about 130,000, with sample sizes in each study being on average around 650 kids. The researchers considered a range of variables that could potentially moderate the relationship between maternal employment and child development. And these included, for example, family structure, two-parent or one-parent, amount of family income, gender of kids, age of kids when mum started working, and a few others. So here are the results of the meta-analysis. So the researchers first considered the association between maternal employment and cognitive development. The results were based upon data from 45 studies. Cognitive development was indexed using tests of IQ, academic ability, school grades, and teacher ratings. There was no evidence of an association between mum's employment and a kid's cognitive development when indexed using IQ, academic ability, or school grades, with the correlations being close to zero. There was a positive association between mum's employment and a kid's cognitive development when the latter was indexed using teacher ratings. That is, if mum worked during the early years, then the kids showed better cognitive development. However, the size of the correlation was very small. For stats people, about 0.05, which looks like this. Not really worth mentioning. So very little evidence indicating that there's an association between mum working during the early years of a kid's life and the cognitive development of a kid. Now, these analyses have been looking at whether there's an overall relationship. However, as mentioned, it may be that there is a relationship, but it depends upon other stuff. That is, the relationship is moderated by one or more factors. The researchers looked at a bunch of different moderators, and there was some hint that the age of the kid when mum started working and family structure moderated the relationship between maternal employment and cognitive development. But the sizes of the effects were close to zero and really not worth focusing on. So in summary, whether considered overall or when considering other factors, mum going to work in the early years of a kid's life does not look like it has any meaningful impact, for better or worse, on a kid's cognitive development. So next, the researchers considered the association between employment and emotional and behavioural problems. And again, the results were based upon data from 45 studies. Emotional and behavioural problems were indexed using measures of externalizing problems and measures of internalizing problems. So externalizing problems involve experiencing negative emotion, for example, anxiety or sadness, or having difficulty controlling impulses in ways that result in maladaptive behaviours directed outwards, such as excessive anger, physical or verbal aggression, or breaking stuff. Internalizing problems involve experiencing negative emotion, again, for example, anxiety or sadness, in ways that result in maladaptive behaviours directed inwardly, such as social withdrawal, avoidance, or restricted eating. So, when considered across these two types of problems, the researchers found no evidence of an association between mum's employment and emotional and behavioural functioning. When looking just at externalising problems, there was no evidence of an association between mum's employment and such problems. However, there was a negative association between mum's employment and internalising problems. The nature of this association was that if mum was working during the early years, then the kid showed fewer internalising problems. But the size of the correlation was very small. Again, for stats people, R was negative 0.05, which looks like this. So very little evidence to suggest that mum working during the early years of a kid's life contributes to the development of emotional or behavioural problems in a kid. If anything, mum working may be beneficial for the kid. So the researchers then investigated whether there were any moderators of this association, looking at the same set of moderators previously considered. There was some suggestion that family structure moderated the relationship between maternal employment and emotional behavioural problems, but once again, the size of the effect was close to zero. Very little going on. So in summary, whether considered overall or when considering other factors, mum going to work in the early years of a kid's life doesn't look like it contributes to the development of emotional or behavioural problems in a kid. So several other papers investigating the relationship between maternal employment and child development have been published since Lucas Thompson's review. The results of these later studies don't alter the conclusions above. Specifically, in terms of cognitive development, one study found a small negative association between maternal employment and kids' cognitive development, but only for non-Hispanic white kids who had a mum that was employed full-time. One study found a small positive association, and a couple of studies found no association between maternal employment and kids' cognitive development. In terms of emotional and behavioural problems, a few studies found a negative association, that is, maternal employment had a beneficial impact, and one study found a positive association, that is, maternal employment had a detrimental impact. So in short, not really any evidence that would lead to a dramatic change in the findings obtained by Lucas Thompson. And again, if anything, it looks like mum going to work may contribute to a reduction in emotional and behavioural problems in kids. So in summary, after about 60 years of research, there's very little evidence to suggest that mum going to work has a detrimental impact on a kid's cognitive or emotional behavioural development, at least when considered across the first 5 years of life. Thus, in conclusion, if you're a mum of young kids who is working or considering going back to work, and you're worried that this might have a negative impact on your kid's development, doesn't look like there's anything to worry about. So that's it for maternal employment and child development. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.